Welcome. I'm Eric Fleming, host of A Moment with Eric Fleming, the podcast of our time. I want to personally thank you for listening to the podcast. If you like what you're hearing, then I need you to do a few things. First, I need subscribers. I'm on Patreon at patreon.com/A Moment with Eric Fleming. Your subscription allows an independent podcaster like me the freedom to speak truth to power and to expand and improve the show. Second, leave a 5-star review for the podcast on the streaming service you listen to it. That will help the podcast tremendously. Third, go to the website, momenteric.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast, leave reviews and comments, listen to past episodes, and even learn a little bit about your host. Lastly, don't keep this a secret like it's your own personal guilty pleasure. Tell someone else about the podcast. Encourage others to listen to the podcast and share the podcast on your social media platforms because it is time to make this moment a movement. Thanks in advance for supporting the podcast of our time. I hope you enjoy this episode as well. Hello, and welcome to another Moment with Eric Fleming. I am your host, Eric Fleming. And I am excited about this podcast today because this falls into one of my loves, which is history, right? I think, I love politics, I love sports, but the beauty of both of those is the history that's attached to them. And that's what makes politics great, or what it should make it great, and what makes sports great is the history that leads up to now. And I'm just a staunch believer that in order to understand where you are, you have to know where you came from. So I'm really, really excited about this podcast, and I hope that you'll be excited about this podcast episode too. But before we get into all that excitement, it's time for a moment of news with Grace G.
Thanks, Eric. Donald Trump won the New Hampshire Republican primary, with Nikki Haley vowing to continue her campaign despite her loss. Prior to the primary, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis dropped out of the Republican presidential race and, along with Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, endorsed Trump. Haley declared she would not accept a vice presidential position under Trump. The U.S. Justice Department criticized the police response to the 2022 Uvalde, Texas school shooting, stating that law enforcement waited too long to confront the shooter, resulting in 21 deaths. Attorney Nathan Wade, involved in the Georgia election interference case against Donald Trump, paid for travel for District Attorney Fani Willis, which raised questions about their relationship. President Biden announced the cancellation of nearly $5 billion in student loans for 74,000 borrowers, increasing the administration's total loan forgiveness to $136.6 billion. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to stop Alabama from proceeding with an execution using nitrogen gas on Kenneth Smith, who previously survived a botched lethal injection. A Minnesota state trooper was charged with unintentional murder and manslaughter in the 2023 shooting death of black motorist Ricky Cobb II. A federal appeals court deemed Pennsylvania's laws that prevent 18 to 20-year-olds from carrying firearms during state emergencies unconstitutional. U.S. lawmakers advanced a bipartisan tax relief bill to enhance tax breaks for families and businesses. A federal judge has halted North Carolina's more stringent same-day voter registration verification. The Ohio legislature overrode Governor DeWine's veto of a bill to ban gender-affirming care for minors and prevent transgender athletes from competing in girls' and women's sports. The U.S. Supreme Court allowed Border Patrol agents to remove razor wire fencing placed by Texas along the Mexican border. And Dexter Scott King, son of Martin Luther King Jr., passed away at the age of 62 from prostate cancer. I am Grace G., and this has been a Moment of News.
All right. Thank you, Grace, for that moment of news. And now it is time for my first guest. My first guest is Satori Shakoor. Satori Shakoor is a storyteller, an artist, social entrepreneur, and a 2017 Kresge Literary Arts Fellow. Satori received early recognition as a background singer slash recording artist when she toured with George Clinton Parliament Funkadelic as one of the brides of Funkenstein. She expanded her performance career to include actor, comedian, and television comedy writer. Satori was the catalyst and a founding member of the award-winning Obsidian Theatre Company in Toronto. Founded in 1999, Obsidian Theatre has become Canada's leading culturally diverse theatre company. 2011, Satori began her professional career as a storyteller, touring the country as a Moth main storyteller and host. She has told stories globally on many stages and storytelling platforms, PBS, NPR, and podcasts. Satori hosts the Twisted Storytellers podcast produced by WDET Radio. Detroit performs live at Marygrove, produced by Detroit Public Television on PBS. Satori is the executive producer for the award-winning The Secret Society of Twisted Storytellers, which he founded in July 2012 in Detroit. The Secret Society of Twisted Storytellers has a global mission to connect humanity, heal and transform community, and to provide an uplifting, thought-provoking, soul-cleansing entertainment experience through the art and craft of storytelling. Satori is the executive director for the Society of the Reinstitutionalization of Storytelling, a Michigan 501c3 nonprofit organization. The Secret Society of Twisted Storytellers partners with businesses, corporations, educational institutions, and faith-based organizations to produce and program live events. Satori designs and facilitates storytelling workshops in the art and craft of storytelling for arts organizations, small businesses, corporations, and to individuals. Some clients include Inside Out Literary Project, Cranes Communication, Duke University, Bowling Green University, Detroit Zoological Society, Edsel and Eleanor Ford House, Bing Youth Institute, Wayne State University School of Social Work, New Detroit Racial Healing and Genealogy Project, MPHI, New Economy Initiative, Issue Media Group, Wayne State University Business School, Arab American National Museum, Hannah House, University of Michigan, and the Detroit Historical Society. Satori was honored by iDetroit, along with 100 other Detroiters who have moved the needle forward for the city of Detroit. In November 2018, upon invitation, Satori installed the Secret Society of Twisted Storytellers Europe Edition in Utrecht, the Netherlands, to address issues of racism. In 2023, Satori was in Manchester, United Kingdom, to take part in a global initiative called In Place of War. Satori studied music performance at Michigan State University, dramatic arts at University of Hawaii, Manoa, and earned a degree in interdisciplinary studies from Wayne State University in 2008. Satori was trained in the art of improvisation by the Groundlings in Los Angeles and Second City, Toronto, in Canada. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest on this podcast, Satori Shakoor. All right, Satori Shakoor, how you doing, sister? You doing good?
Yeah, I just recently had a chest X-ray because I was having all this, issues and things, and found out it was pneumonia. So I'm taking some antibiotics. And I feel better already, but yeah.
Well, I really appreciate, one, it's an honor to have you on, and two, I really appreciate you coming on in those circumstances.
No problem. I've been walking around functioning but it got worse. So I just went to the doctor to find out because I'm going on vacation, going to Jamaica, and I didn't want to be. So I checked it out, but I've been functioning. I hosted an event last night. I just so it's not like I feel terrible, terrible, terrible. I'm getting better.
Yeah, well, you got some incentive to get better. That's for sure. Um,
Yeah.
so normally, like when I start an interview, I usually start off with a quote, something
Hmm.
that either that person may have said, written in a book, or applies to the conversation we're going to have. So
Hmm.
your quote is, when I moved back to Detroit in 2011, I saw all these abandoned houses, drug dealers that were really the neighborhood watch, only 11 people living on the block, and graffiti being the most beautiful artwork you could find in the neighborhood. I felt gutted and wondered what if people could use their personal living experience to express and heal themselves and make a contribution to all who are listening. 10 years have proven that it's all working. What does that quote mean to you?
Yes. Well, I moved back to Detroit in 2001 when my son was severely injured in a car accident. He and my mother subsequently passed away, and I went into a deep period of grief. So in 2011, which included Wall Street crashing, and I had to be sort of a nomad, because I vowed to do what I love to do for the rest of my life, no matter what. So I moved into a bedroom in my sister's house, and I had an epiphany because 6 years later, I noticed that Detroit was coming back to life like I was. And I had become a Moth star. The Moth is a storytelling organization based in New York that I won one of their contests. And then from that point on, they were flying me around the country telling my story of grief and loss. And I was getting a lot of emails from all over the world. And I found storytelling was my purpose. Storytelling to me is like breathing. It's like something very natural. I grew up in a family, old Black women from the Jim Crow South. And so that was the language we spoke. I didn't know it was something in the world, like a category that I didn't know it was there. So I found my purpose. And I wondered as an artist if storytelling is bringing me back from the dead, like, could it bring Detroit back? And so I did an experiment. Still, now by this time, I'm living in a basement in a friend's house. And I started the Secret Society of Twisted Storytellers. We started with 45 seats in 2011, and we've grown since then. We're going into our 12th year. We've had Dick Gregory on our show. We've had George Clinton on our show, Dr. George Faison, Michael Collier, Naomi Magid Long, and also local Detroit people you've never heard of, and you probably have heard of. Some you may have heard of, but they all have a story to tell, as you do. And that story is a package of their lived experience, a package of wisdom that I present to a sold out audience of 300 or to 1,000 people. And the mission is to connect humanity, heal, and transform community, and to provide an uplifting, thought provoking, soul cleansing entertainment experience through the art and craft of storytelling. So that's where my experience in healing led me to want to extend it to the world. So we do a show 10 months out of the year, and we live stream it. We have a YouTube channel. We proliferate the stories, and people watch them online, and they can watch them anytime on demand, and they find value not only in the listening to the stories, but in the sharing of the stories. At the same time, I'm committed to developing listeners, especially in the 21st information dulling environment we live in. And our attention span has decreased. So I do believe that listening is a revolutionary act, And at the highest level, it's love. It's something we extend. We can't be forced to listen, but it does grant being to another human being. It helps us understand the human experience. It dissolves and breaks down intergenerational barriers, gender barriers, racial barriers, because we get to the heart of what we all have in common, which is that we are human and that we live, we die, we grieve, we mourn, and we continue to do our best to survive.
That's a beautiful concept. Listening is love. That's pretty cool. Um, you describe yourself as a midwife of stories and storytellers. How
Yeah.
hard is it, in your opinion, for African Americans to tell their stories?
I think that African American, it's very easy. It's very easy when you have a midwife to birth that story, to help to assist in birthing that story. Because as a midwife, I provide encouragement. I provide, I'm the first audience, the first ear. I think African Americans come from a tradition of griots, an African tradition, like a lot of indigenous people. That's how we pass down our legacy and our histories. So storytelling is part of the church. Well, it used to be part of the church experience. It was called a testimony. But now we have we have online churches and we have in-person churches, but the environments have changed a bit, and the messaging has changed a bit, and the focus has changed a bit. So I want just to have regular people share their experiences that and their and showcase their extraordinary achievements. So I think it's easy because it's something I love to do. So, and I have an ear for storytelling. I have the skill, and I teach storytelling as part of my profession. And I work with the state of Michigan. I've worked with universities, Duke University, all kind of universities in different capacities to facilitate storytelling, to help people bring out their stories, because storytelling is not only an art and a craft, it's also a science. It's the most powerful and effective delivery system of information and ideas. It's a form of communication. So if you do want to express yourself, you want to get across your campaign ideas or like that, you would use storytelling, because storytelling lights up the entire brain. Cortisol, dopamine, oxytocin are all they all are encouraged. It floods the human being, and cortisol makes you want to pay attention. It wants to know what's going to happen next. Oxytocin, dopamine, they all work together to encourage feelings of empathy. And so you associate and identify with the storyteller, and so therefore you have the whole brain lit up as opposed to maybe PowerPoints and information and statistics. So it's a very high form of communication. It's effective because I know I can ask you now, do you remember any stories you were told as a child? And you probably can tell me yes, and you can probably tell me exactly how that story went. And so it lives with you. Not only does it live with you, it's your story now. And you probably interpret it in different ways. You might use it when somebody's, you want to encourage somebody, or you want to entertain somebody, or you want to get across a point. You may extract a story someone told. Oh, my aunt told me a long time ago that. So it's human.
Yeah,
It's
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but the reason why I asked that question is because when I used to talk to younger people on a regular basis, it
mhm,
seemed to me, especially our children, it seemed to me that they had more trouble verbally expressing themselves. Now they've got all these tools on social media, whether it's Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, whatever, uh,
mhm,
uh, Twitch, that they can use to express themselves freely. But face to face, it seemed like that was a challenge. Your experience, I guess, is different because you know how to extract stuff out of people.
Well, it's because young people, uh, they don't have, and most people, I would venture to say, uh, do not have the gift of an experience of being heard. Yeah, so when young people people listening, listening is not just hearing words, and it's an action.
Yeah.
It's something that you know when you're not being listened to.
Yeah.
You Everyone knows, oh, they're not listening. So to be able to really listen is to give up your need to agree or disagree, give up your, well, that's not how, to just completely surrender to what the other person is saying without judgment, without evaluations or assessments. And when you listen to another person's communication, you're going to always have questions if you're truly interested, because they're not going to say everything, but there'll be something that they say that will make you curious, will make you want to get more clarification. And or there's something that they say that you know they may not want to have said that. They kind of brush by it. And when you go in and you say, well, you know, you said such and such and such, most people are surprised that you even heard that. So they trust you. An environment of trust happens when someone is truly listening to another speaking. When someone is truly listening, that other person feels heard, they open up and they volunteer their stories, their experiences, because they want to share. They desire to let it out. It's like breathing. I breathe in, I breathe out. So people breathe in their experience. They want to share. They want to be encouraged. So I have a TV show. I'm a host of Detroit Performs Live from Marygrove, and I host and I interview. And a lot of the people that I interview are young people. Some of them are like in elementary school, and they are very shy to start out with. And so there's an empathy. Oh, they're shy. Let me, even before the interview starts, let me comfort them. Let me get related to them so that the on-camera part and the microphones and all that don't intimidate them. And once they feel heard, there it is. You're in full communication with someone, a loving experience.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel that. I feel what you're saying on that. Because I think a lot of times our people, especially our young people, don't feel like they're being heard. I think they're learning more to express themselves now as this political climate is evolving. But overall, I think that's been a general concern. You stated that you learned the art of storytelling from your Southern family members. You had mentioned that in your opening answer. What
Mm-hmm.
is the importance, and you partially answered the question, but what is the importance of storytelling in preserving the legacy of our culture?
Well, like I like watching a lot of YouTube. I like watching the YouTube of people that are like from 20 something to 40 something, because they're struggling with male female relationships. They're trying to figure out who they are. They have, it's almost like they were born 20, 40 years ago, and there was nothing that happened before that. They romanticize certain parts of history. So right now the current thing is for young men to talk about their leaders, and they want women to submit to them like they did in the 60s and the 50s. But they fail to look at the history, which is, if they go to other YouTube channels, they can see documentaries of women and men speaking at that time in history. So they take certain parts of what they heard and use them to empower their arguments, but they neglect to know their history, to know what happened before is to have it's to have knowledge, it's to have facts, to have power in navigating your world. So I think that storytelling, because we can see how powerful storytelling is, because there are certain states that want to erase history. Trevor Noah, his new stand-up comedy special, which he did in Detroit, he says, "Why do people want to erase their history? What? Why?" He told the story of Christopher Columbus, who never stepped foot on this soil, but he celebrated as as someone who discovered America, but he
Right.
never went beyond the Caribbean. But so it's all mixed up. So that story's been passed down, and it's only been a few years ago that we've started getting awareness that we can shift that narrative and call it something else, Indigenous People Day, or a lot of Black folks don't even celebrate it,
Right.
or there are holidays that don't even get celebrated anymore. 4th of July, whose independence were they talking about? So it's the more the more history, the more knowledge and facts you have, because our histories have been buried, they've been stolen, they've been co-opted, they've been, like, I'm watching Baz Reeves. I did not know that the Lone Ranger was based on Baz Reeves, but Baz Reeves was African American man, and although his story is a little problematic, he still was an African American man. So we take some of our accomplishments, some of our history, some of our stories, bury them, or slap another face on them.
Right.
And so if we knew the things that we knew, then we could have, I don't want to say ammunition, because I'm not a person of violence or wants to fight, but we could actually stand in the face of narratives and put ours side by side.
Yeah. And I watched that Trevor Noah. I've yet to watch the Bass Reeves, but I've watched that Trevor Noah special, and I just love him and the way that he tells stories, right, and
Yeah,
how he incorporates that into comedy, and it's
yeah,
very relatable. But to your point about the whitewashing of history,
mm,
I just think it's really, really important. I've always respected people who could tell stories, and I took great pride being in a position where I could meet people who made historical achievements or whatever. And just to hear them tell their story, that was more important than a picture with them, or
mm,
a an autograph or something like that. Just to be in a room and listen to them talk about what they were feeling at that time. Like you said, you remember that more so than, oh yeah, well I took a picture with Rosa Parks, but to sit there and talk to Rosa Parks, that's a whole different ball game. So
yes.
I appreciate what you're saying about the power in that. So I used to listen to this radio show growing up in Chicago that started with the line, just like the talking drums of Africa once brought vital information to their community, right?
Hmm.
What is or could be our quote unquote talking drum in today's Black community?
The, well, I think that in our community, it's sharing, it's storytelling, it's connecting ourselves. Like, one of the things that I'm noticing from doing the Secret Society Twisted Storytellers, there's always your intention and then all of these unexpected benefits of it. One of the things I wanted to do was connect the people of Detroit. We talk about a Black community, we talk about community, but what is that? Like, where do you point to that? And I think it's in our relationships, it's in the way we know each other and care for each other, and the trust that we have. So I wanted, and people tell me, yeah, I was in Whole Foods, and some people walked up to me and said, I heard your story at the Secret Society Twisted Storytellers. How's your mother?
Yeah.
or mentorships happening, or one storyteller who speaks, Dr. Portia Lockett, who speaks around the country on grief and loss. My assistant, who works with me, she has a nonprofit called Remembering Cherubs, where she supports women who have had miscarriages.
Hmm.
I introduced them, and now my assistant, Monica, through Dr. Lockett, now is connected to Henry Ford Hospitals and has an outreach. So it's not only it's people used to call it networking, but it's more powerful than networking because you've just shared who you are. You think you know that person because that person has shared their struggle, their intimacy. So there's always fodder. If you've heard somebody's story, there's always a place to start that conversation. And it's always with something they heard of your story that they can relate to, they can admire, they can congratulate you on, or feel empathy for you. So it's just a human connection. It's very powerful. It can be instant. And so I think that the talking drum is like, I guess, information sharing.
Right.
Yeah. So like I said, storytelling is the most powerful delivery system and effective delivery system of information and ideas. And then there's all kind of storytelling. I read where during into slavery, they would braid the hair. The designs in the hair would be the pathway to the Underground Railroad. So that's a story too.
Right.
And so,
I just found that out myself about how they would put certain things in the braids to kind of help people along their way.
hmm
Yeah. Yeah, like
yeah,
rice and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
yeah.
I think that's pretty cool. I'm sorry, go ahead. I'm
No, it's the creative ways in which we have survived, which we have drawn courage from, has been in our own presence, our hair, our skin, our pain, our stories. So we have survived because of each other, and we will continue to move forward. Like with Kamala Harris, I saw her on the Kiki Palmer's show, and one of the things I wanted to do so bad was to teach Kamala Harris how to tell stories when she's in these spaces, because she's giving out information, but you can't really carry it. It's not in a container. You need that story to carry that information, to inspire and to, you know. So I was like, woo, maybe one of the things I'd love to do in the future is maybe target some of these representatives of the people and show them how to get their messages out more powerful. Yeah, because I work with lawyers and their opening arguments, their closing arguments, work with people who are going to present their whatever they want to present to Congress, kids or mothers who are Black mothers who are affected negatively. There's a big maternal mortality issue here in Detroit due to implicit bias, which Kamala Harris is talking about.
excuse me.
Breastfeeding, all of these things. Black women want to breastfeed now, but breastfeeding will completely shut down formula, which is capitalistic. I mean, you buy this for your baby, which won't immunize your baby around all these diseases. And now then I heard a commercial, just like mommy's milk. This formula is just so the money's got to always be in the mix. And so it's like, no, let's tell these stories. So yeah, it's or I'm working with the young fathers who wants their stories extracted to do a documentary to change the narrative of Black fathers don't care about their kids. So people are finding, especially now in this digital age, that storytelling is built for now. It's always been relevant, but it's really built for now. Every little TikTok thing you see, little skit, all these things are storytelling.
Yeah. So you've had the privilege of being an actress, portraying
Mm-hmm.
different characters throughout your career. With this
Mm-hmm.
endeavor into storytelling, which one is harder, being a movie character or being yourself?
Being a movie character.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why is that? Why is that harder?
Because being a movie character, you are uh, required to be part of a story that someone else is directing and telling. And so therefore you have to become another part of yourself, or you have to become this particular character who may be older than you or younger than you or completely different than you. And you have to create something and then create a whole backstory for you to live out of. Being myself, I know what things smelled like when I walked into the to a room, or I don't have to do anything except share and be, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You were once asked what makes a good story, and you said high stakes. Define what
Yeah.
you mean by high stakes and how does that make a good story?
The higher the stakes, the more compelling the story. So stakes are life and death. Like there was a TV series like to use an example called 24. And in 24 hours, he had to save the world. Can he do it? You know he's going to do it because at the end, you know, we're going to get episode 7.
Right.
uh, how does he do it? Or I or you know, all stories have stakes, but people don't know where to identify where the stakes are. The stakes are in you really want this. You're really going for it and you have a disappointment. How do I get back up there? You know, if nothing happens in your story or nothing significant happens, it's an essay. So we have to have that challenge to our thinking, challenge to our physicality, challenge to our lives, and so that we can rise to the occasion of overcoming. So though that's the stakes, will we make it in time? Life or death? I
Yeah.
really wanted to be that star football player, and then I got injured in the game. What do I do now? Who do I become out of this? So those are some examples of having high stakes. And if you notice, if you watch movies or TV shows, um, as soon as you put a baby or a child in the story, the stakes automatically raise high.
Right.
How is she, how is she going to get out of this situation with that baby? That baby's going to cry and give her away, you know. So it's all these elements of high stakes where we're all on edge to see how it's going to turn out. So
Right.
yes, yeah, you got to find the stakes in your story.
All right. So, final question. We're
Hmm.
going to travel forward in time.
Hmm.
In December of 2024, what is going to
Hmm.
be the story that is told? And this is since it's a political show, this is probably the most political question you're going to get. what what's going to be the story at the end of 2024?
Of the world,
Of the world, the United States, what do you think the story is going to be?
well, that's where the stakes are because December 2024, we're either going to be, in my view, we're either going to be on the brink of a whole new world of disaster, or we will be at stasis. We'll be in a holding pattern. But I think that until we are able to dismantle the system of white supremacy patriarchy, which is an artificial environment that we've all been socialized and politicized to adapt to, making ourselves unnatural, making ourselves not free, then we're not going to be able to really know how the world would look. So we have to dismantle this system which suppresses our natural self-expression. It's artificial and it does not work. And all of us perpetuate it in what we don't know about ourselves, which I call it the chip. All of us have a chip and we're chipmatized. And when we're not thinking, we then adapt. I'm going to lose my job if I say that. If I actually tell the truth, someone's going to shoot me. There's the chip comes with policing, thinking that manages your behavior. But what I'm doing is I'm practicing freedom, which is to say, I'm noticing my chip when my chip wants to manage me and when I want to test reality. I'm going to say the thing and see what happens. I say the thing, and sometimes I get partners. I agree with you. Or, oh, yes, we can pay you that amount of money. So it's like I think for December 2024, we need to start practicing freedom now. Practicing freedom, which is how would we behave outside of this system, which is managing our thinking and behavior? How, we're in a system that has us think that our vote is going to make a difference. And we know one vote is not going to make a difference. We know that a whole lot of votes will make a difference because it'll buy some another set of votes called electoral votes. So it's kind of, it's all very skewed, but we need folks that are going to tell the truth, tell the truth about everything. I just was watching Nikki Haley try to avoid talking about slavery. I mean, we already know you're avoiding that. It drives you crazy not to hear a truthful answer. And so it's refreshing to hear honesty because it infuses your cells with light,
Yeah.
So
All right.
yeah, so I think we got to all of us have to be in action about December 2024 because it's up for grabs right now.
Yeah. All right, sister. So, how can people get in touch with you? How can they plug into your shows, all that kind of stuff? This is the time to plug what you're doing.
You can visit twistedtellers.org, twistedtellers.org to find all about the Secret Society of Twisted Storytellers. You can visit my website, which is satorishakoor.com. And between those two websites, you should be able to find me everywhere.
All right. Well, Satori Shakoor, I appreciate you coming on. Again, overcoming some challenges physically. I hope that you recover well enough to get to Jamaica and enjoy it. And again, I appreciate you coming on and talking about the work that you're doing and why it's important.
Well, I appreciate your invitation. It was lovely meeting you. I'm glad that you're doing this podcast and that you're getting these voices and these points of views out for people to be able to access. So thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you. All right, guys. Happy New Year to you too. And we're going to catch y'all on the other side. All right, and we are back. And so now it is time for our next guest, which is Suzanne Harmon Munson. Suzanne Harmon Munson has written books, 3 published and 4 on the way in a variety of genres, fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. She has an unusual distinction of being an author of quote unquote traditional history, as well as a pioneer in a new genre, metaphysical history. She has written a well regarded book of traditional history, John Jefferson's Godfather, The Man Behind a Man, a biography of Thomas Jefferson's influential mentor, George White. George Whitf, signer of the Declaration of Independence, America's first professor of law, senior statesman, and a model for the ethical servant leader. Soon to be published is a related book, First in Law, First in Leadership, The College of William Mary. More recently, she boldly explored what Jefferson might have to say to us from his current place in the spirit in the book, The Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson. This premiered on Amazon as the #1 new release in political commentary. Her next books in this genre, The Metaphysical Leonard Cohen, The Last Interview, and The Metaphysical Van Gogh. Her latest book, Of Loss and Love, A Journey of the Heart, takes an entirely new turn. This is a series of reflections that she began after the loss of her husband several years ago. The book's beautiful passages offer insight on dealing with grief, learning to love mindfully, and searching for the love of a new partner later in life. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest on this podcast, Suzanne Munson. All right, Suzanne Munson. How you doing, ma'am? You doing good?
I am doing great, and I hope you are too.
I am, especially now that I have you on, because I want to talk to you about a couple of historical figures that you've written books about, George Wythe and Thomas Jefferson. But before we get into that, what I like to do with guests is to give them a quote. And that quote could be something that they've said, something they've written, or something that relates to the topics we're going to discuss. So your quote is this: democracy is not simply a license to indulge individual whims and proclivities. It is also holding oneself accountable to some reasonable degree for the conditions of peace and chaos that impact the lives of those who inhabit one's beloved extended community. What does that quote mean to you?
Well, that's what my books are all about. The two people that I wrote about, Thomas Jefferson and George Wythe. Jefferson was George Wythe's student. And so Jefferson was studying law under Wythe, but Wythe had a captive audience with him, and he required him to read all kinds of history and learn languages and so on. So they studied the ancient Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, and those people who wrote, and some of the Romans who wrote about the characteristics of good government and the whole object of a good government that's well run for the people, of the people, for the people, and by the people, is for basic happiness among the people. You're not going to be happy under an evil dictator, for sure. Maybe a few people who get rich that way will be.
Yeah.
A handful of people who are toady up to the dictator, but the common person will not do well under a bad ruler. And so that's why we came up with a democratic republic, so that we could get rid of a bad ruler without bloodshed. In the history of mankind, you had to kill somebody or send them off to some island. That was a little more humane than killing, but usually somebody had to kill somebody, and then the people who came into power usually weren't that much better. So at least we got away from that, and we got away from hereditary titles, keeping the kingship in the same family, even though the son was an idiot. And so we had a very noble experiment with this government that the founding fathers came up with. And it was set up for the happiness of the people and, peace. peaceful transition of power was a bedrock value.
Yes, ma'am. All right. So talk to me about George Wythe. Who was he, and why is he an important figure in the formation of the United States?
Well, he's known as the forgotten founding father now, and he shouldn't be. And I'm trying to bring him back into a world of respect, which he deserves. Everybody remembers Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death, but Wythe was far more influential than Patrick Henry and did far more for the betterment of this country. And so I got really interested in him 10 years or so ago when I read an account of his death. And he was the only signer of the Declaration of Independence to be murdered. That's kind of what he's known for now, but that was kind of a minor detail in his life. And he was done away with by a bad nephew who wanted an early inheritance. And I think he was collateral damage. The nephew wanted, there were some people of color who were in the will, and he would inherit their share if they were gone. So he poisoned everybody in the household one day. So that's the story that I started out with. And then in the book about that, the author went on and on and on about what a noble person Wythe was. And I said, wow, this is a great guy. Why don't we know more about him today? He's still a role model, because we're so lacking in ethics today. And he was such an ethical person, admired universally. And I said, somebody needs to write a new biography about this guy. So I couldn't at the time. I had a job, but as soon as I retired, a light bulb went off in my head, and I said, I can do this book. And it took me 5 years to do it because for some reason I couldn't focus at home. So I'd have to go away to various writing retreats and spiritual retreats for 2 days or a week and work on it, focus 100% on it, and then come home, and then a month or two would pass and then I'd get back to it. So it took me a long time to do it because when you write history, every sentence has to be correct. You can't make up stuff. And everything had to be footnoted, and I had a bibliography and so on. So, he was responsible for, I think he had a huge responsibility for getting the United States off to the right start. He taught approximately 200 of our best leaders in the early days. And these weren't just members of Congress and presidents like Jefferson, but also members of the judiciary. It was very important that we have honest judges because bribery was the way of the world at that time, still is in a lot of countries, bribery of judges. And so he also taught Chief Justice John Marshall and another justice of the Supreme Court, as well as men who became judges at all levels of the court system. And so the number of congressmen and senators and diplomats and presidents that he influenced was very, very long. I have them listed in the book, all I could find. And one scholar said that Wythe influenced the direction of the United States for a full 50 years during his time and after his time.
Yeah, and that was in doing the research for this interview. It was kind of impressive that he was the guy who was kind of the mentor. In my mind, there was an African American law professor at Howard, and I don't want to say the wrong name. For some reason, Thurston is the name that keeps coming up in my mind, but there was an African-American law professor at Howard that basically taught people like Thurgood Marshall and others, and they credit him in the same way that you talk about George Wythe, that he was the guy that mentored all of these young African-American lawyers to fight the civil rights battle in the court system. And so looking at Mr. Wythe being the guy who taught Thomas Jefferson and John Marshall and all these other folks, James Madison, all these folks. He was like America's first law professor. Some other folks will say, it's just that's an incredible role to have, to be a mentor to all those folks. And from what I understand, when he died, I think Jefferson was the president and Marshall was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes, and there were members of Congress and the Senate and lots of governors. I think I counted 7 governors that he had mentored.
Right.
Yeah.
And he taught at William and Mary, is that correct?
Yes, William and Mary in Williamsburg. It's the second oldest college in America.
Right.
After Harvard.
Right.
But it was way ahead of Harvard in having a law school. Harvard didn't have its law school until 3 decades later.
Right, because Harvard was primarily a seminary. Harvard and Yale started off as seminaries, more so,
yes.
and evolved into universities.
That's right.
Because I think William and Mary is considered the oldest liberal arts college.
Yes, well, they had a wonderful opportunity when the revolution broke out. All the professors who had ties to England left. And so the Virginians thought this was just great, that they could reshape William and Mary, their only institution of higher learning. And right away, they went on to reform it. And that included America's first law school, because lawyers were held in very low esteem at the time because of poor training, a lack of good training.
Right. Because, we look at law now, you got to go to law school, you got to pass the bar and all that. But back then, basically, all you had to do was just kind of sit around with a judge, and he'll give
That's
you an
right.
examination, and then you become a lawyer, just like that.
Right, apprenticeship to a senior lawyer. But in George Wyth's case, he was an apprentice to his uncle, and his uncle was too busy really to teach him very much and just gave him scut work to do and, unpaid labor. And so at a very early age, George Wyth knew that if he was going to learn anything, he'd have to learn it himself. So he became one of America's most important self-taught scholars. He had one of the biggest libraries in America. And he wanted to share his knowledge. He was a wonderful mentor. And he loved teaching. He loved sharing his knowledge.
Now, you mentioned earlier about how Mr. Wyth was murdered. And the black man that was in question was Michael Brown. That was, I think he was one of his servants that he had freed. And then he started teaching him the law. Is that correct?
That's right. He was teaching him. Well, I think he was too young to learn the law. He would have probably gotten to that eventually. But he was teaching him languages and all the things that Wyth thought were important. And he was described as a good boy. In some ways he emulated George Wyth. And it was very tragic because he was the first to die of the poisoning of the arsenic that was put in the coffee one morning. And the housekeeper, who was also a freed slave, but George Wyth was paying her wages and she was working for him as a housekeeper. She drank the coffee and it did damage her, but she did live on after that.
So the reason why I bring that up is because Mr. Wyth was probably one of the earliest opponents to slavery, even though he had inherited slaves through some kind of way through his family. He was against it, and so eventually he was one of the first of the founders to free his slaves. Am I telling that part of the story right?
Yes, there were a few other Virginians that I know of who did free their slaves, and I think they were influenced by George Wyth. Now, Wyth had a different background from the aristocracy in Virginia. He was the second son, so he did not inherit the farm or the plantation. His older brother did. Eventually, he did after his brother died, and he did inherit the slaves. But and then when he married into a slaveholding family, a pretty well-to-do family that had household servants. So very quickly after his wife died, he was able legally to free the slaves. But as a judge, he had to abide by the law of the land, which was that slaves were property. But toward the end of his life, the last year of his life, he had a case before him as a judge where he was able to free a woman and her 2 children who were slaves, who wanted their freedom. On 2 counts. The first count was their ethnicity. They more or less proved that they were Native Americans and not African Americans. And then the second count, he went out on a limb and he said that due to Virginia's Bill of Rights, Declaration of Rights, that all men, all people are inherently free. And he freed them on that count. Well, that went up to the Supreme Court, as the higher court, and the people were eventually freed on the basis of race. But I think the ruling was struck down that all men are free, all people are free. So that didn't go anywhere. And but Wythe was very popular among the aristocracy. He was the lawyer of the most prominent people in Virginia, but he was not like them. And I credit that to his Quaker heritage on his mother's side. They were humanitarians. They believed in the equality of people and the equality of sexes. They educated their women. His great-grandfather wrote the first anti-slavery treatise in America back in the late 1700s. And this was, I think, Ben Franklin eventually reprinted that and distributed it. So George Wythe would have read what his great-grandfather wrote about the evils of slavery, proving in different places in the Bible where it was wrong, because everybody else was proving that it was fine, because in the Old Testament, a lot of people had slaves. So if it was in the Old Testament, it had to be okay. Well, multiple wives are in the Old Testament too. So lots of things are in the Old Testament that we don't do today.
Yes, ma'am. All right, so let's bring it forward to the present. Based on your scholarship on Wythe and his prize pupil, Thomas Jefferson, how would they view today's American law and politics?
I think they would be extremely concerned. And so I wrote 2 books about America's government. The second was called The Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson, and that is what Jefferson would say today if you could ask him questions about our government and other institutions. And before I started this book, I went online and found living Jefferson scholars who had written books. And most of them had emails attached to universities. So I presented this as a project. If you could talk to Jefferson today, what questions would you ask? So I incorporated their questions as well as the ones that I had. So what came forth in that particular book, and because Jefferson, of course, came after Wythe in power, and Wythe chose to be a judge and a teacher. That's why he's a forgotten founding father. He wasn't a general, and he didn't run for president. And so he chose to be important in Virginia. Anyway, so I would say what Jefferson was president when partisan politics reared its ugly head. And I think he particularly would have a lot of concerns about what's going on now. So I'll list a few. Corruption in government, congressmen serving themselves rather than the people, the influence of big money in elections and laws, a lack of ethics in Washington, biased media. Freedom of the press was very, very important to the founding fathers, but they were hoping that, the press would present the facts rather than opinion. A lack of critical thinking and laziness on the part of voters, a violation of the essential rule of peaceful transfer of power from one leader to another. What happened on January 6th would have been their worst nightmare. Misuse of the military, foreign wars that are not directly related to protecting our own shores. All these are mentioned in my Jefferson book, The Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson. Higher education becoming top-heavy, not supporting students as its number one goal. And erosion of the principle of church and state when it comes to funding, particularly all the talk that's going on now about tax dollars for schools, religious schools. That's going on now in Virginia. That's a very slippery slope. So if you want me to elaborate on any of those points, they are all in that book, The Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson.
Which I want to double back on one point before I address that specific point about the book. So Mr. Wythe, for y'all, he was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, but he wasn't a signer of the Constitution because his wife got ill. And so he left the Constitutional Convention to tend to his wife. Is that?
That's right. He was a delegate to the convention that wrote the Constitution, and he played a very, very important early role. He wrote the rules of conduct for that convention based on how he ran his own show in the Virginia legislature. And without the rules of conduct, it could have dissolved into chaos because every new state sent representatives, and some were for the Constitution, some weren't. There was always going to be a lot of arguing, a lot of egos on parade. And so you needed very strict rules. And he would have stayed and he would have been very influential in that Constitutional Convention. But his wife became ill and he had to go home. He felt that he should go home. But later on, he was one of the saviors of the Constitution. It had to be ratified. There were 13 states at the time. And ratification was considered final, but it really wasn't if 10 states ratified. But if Virginia didn't ratify, it really would have been a paper tiger. It wouldn't have gone anywhere. And so all eyes were on Virginia during their ratification convention in 1788. And it was a free-for-all. Almost the Constitution was not ratified by the largest and most powerful and influential and wealthiest state. And at the time, Virginia's borders stretched to the Mississippi. It was the thought leader of the country with all the founding fathers from Virginia. So Patrick Henry and a lot of influential people were lined up to oppose the ratification, and he went on for hours and hours against it, mainly because they feared that a powerful government central government, national government, could overturn slavery. They were very concerned about that, or just an overriding government that would come in and invade your house and tax you to death and all that. So with the promise of a Bill of Rights protecting individuals, Wythe persuaded the Virginia Convention to ratify the Constitution. And he did so toward the end after all the haranguing that went on. And they listened to him because he was the senior statesman and revered for his ethics, scholarship, and statesmanship.
Yeah, I definitely wanted to mention that because he, like you said, he was only founding father in that context to be murdered. And so he was more than just a teacher. He was an active participant in the formation of the government. So let me get back to modern day. What qualities should ethical political leaders have?
Well, one of the questions in the book, The Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson, is what would you do if you were president today? And the answer that's in the book is that I'm speaking for Jefferson right now, who might say, I couldn't do anything right now as president because I wouldn't have a sufficient following. He called for a revolution, not the bloody kind. He did like revolutions, but he would call for a revolution of ethics. And but he would say that you need to start with a core group, a core ethical group in Congress. So he would say that, I couldn't be president now because there's just too much turmoil going on, couldn't get anything done. But maybe I would start in Congress, and I would have a circle of ethical people. And we would enlarge that circle. And eventually, with success, we would have a large enough group that we could affect changes. He would not have liked the idea of term limits, but he might feel that they are necessary today because of all the corruption in government. He would hate all the big money that's swaying elections now. They didn't have that in his day. That came on later, and even 150 years ago, that was beginning to be an influence in presidential elections. And so, yeah, I think he'd be very concerned and would call for an ethical revolution, not a bloody revolution, but an ethical one. And it's possible that could take place. I think things have to get so bad, and people are parading around today in Washington with no ethics, carrying on the big lies. I hope that the public will get disgusted enough that more honest people will start running for office. The problem is a lot of people who have a good background in business and who were not swayed either way, not terribly liberal or terribly conservative, who would be centrist. A lot of them are out on the golf course. They're just letting things go. And they need to be involved in public discourse. We've become very, very lazy, and we think, well, politics is a dirty business. I don't want my child involved in politics, or I don't want to put my neck out there and get it chopped off. And it is a dirty business. But we have a couple of people in Congress now in my area. One is a Republican and one is a Democrat. And I follow them, and they're basically really hardworking public servants. And the Republican keeps his mouth shut about a lot of the trash that's going on, and he just keeps his head down and works. Same with the Democrat. So we need more people like that who really will work for the public.
So based on your answer, accountability, honesty, not influenced by big money, not corrupt, and more concerned about working for the people than themselves. Those would be the attributes as far as an
Correct.
ethical leader.
Yes, correct.
Okay. Why do you think, and this will be the final question, why do you think we've had such an erosion as far as ethics goes in politics? Because there was one particular answer in a metaphysical, Thomas Jefferson, where the term lowest common denominator was used. And that's
Right.
something that I have been saying for a long time. Just kind of expound upon that. Because I believe settling for the lowest common denominator is one of the reasons why ethics and politics is eroded. Kind of enumerate on that and enumerate some others. Elaborate on that and enumerate some others.
Well, voters have gotten lazy. A lot of them are just listening to biased media. And I think the founding fathers would be very concerned about. It's been proven that some of these media people have lied, and they've been brought to court for lying about the election process, and they've lost. But if you just listen to one point of view and not try to listen to both sides of a question, ethics will be compromised. And also the lack of the demise of our newspapers has been, well, they're not totally lost, but the reduction in staffs among our newspapers is very, very concerning, because we used to have more investigative reporters who would ferret out corruption at all levels, local, state, and national. If the people in Washington think they can get by with murder, which they probably can, and nobody's going to report on it, or get by with corruption and nobody's going to report on it, and the people don't care, then you're going to have corruption growing. And so yes, we've gotten quite lazy. We are not critical thinkers as a country. We listen to whatever social media resonates with us. A lot of people love red meat, even though red meat may be dishonest. They still love it. It appeals to them. They like to be mad about everything. But we need to be balanced. We need to look, a broken clock will be right twice a day.
Right.
The Democrats are right occasionally. The Republicans are right occasionally. But they're so balled up in partisan politics that they can't even pass necessary legislation, just legislation that everybody should agree on. For example, our immigration laws need Congress is at fault to a great extent on what's happening there, but they won't revise the laws because they want to blame the party in power or one thing or another. And so partisan politics have eroded ethics. People are lying now, bald-faced lies. I see them every day.
Yeah.
And nobody's calling them out on it.
Yeah. And I agree with you on that. I think that, Jefferson, one of his famous sayings or concepts was that he felt that the press was the fourth estate of government, that was the tool to inform the masses and hold elected officials, especially government, because he was one of the anti-federalists. So he wanted to have something to hold that government monster, in his viewpoint, in check. And that's why he valued the press. And when the press is not honest and forthright, then that's going to misinform the people and lead to chaos. I definitely agree with that assessment. And as somebody that's been a former elected official, I've seen it firsthand, and trying to navigate through that to do your job is not easy. And so I respect the congressman that you mentioned and anybody else, and we need more people like that. All right, so that's my commentary. Now it's time to plug your books. How can people get Jefferson's Godfather, The Man Behind the Man, and The Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson? And how can they reach you to try to, get you, because you do a TED Talk as well about ethics in government. So go ahead and make your plug.
My two books about government so far, I've got another one coming, but it's not on Amazon yet. But they're available on Amazon. The first is Jefferson's Godfather. My name is Suzanne Munson, and that's the biography of George Wythe. And the second one is The Metaphysical Thomas Jefferson, what Jefferson would say today about, not just about government, but about all of our institutions, religion, higher education, use of the military, and a number of subjects. So I think you can reach me. I have an author site, which is in the books. It's Suzanne Munson -author.com, and you can reach me that way. So, and I think there's information in the books about how you can reach me through my publisher, or my email may even be in there, probably. Probably, I know my website is.
Well, Suzanne Munson, it has really been an honor and a privilege to talk to you. as somebody that has now been a guest on a podcast, anytime you want to come on, you're more than welcome. I think, the beauty of history is that we can find our way through turbulent times if we just understand where we came from. And so your contribution to helping us find our way is greatly appreciated. And I thank you for writing those books, and I thank you for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure.
All right, guys, and we're going to catch y'all on the other side. All right, and we are back. And so now it is time for our final guest. And that guest is Dr. Karen L. Cox. Karen L. Cox is a professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, an award-winning historian, and a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. She is the author of 4 books and the editor or co-editor of 2 volumes of Southern history. Her books include Dixie's Daughters, The United Daughters of the Confederacy and the Preservation of Confederate Culture, Dreaming of Dixie, How the South Was Created in American Popular Culture, Goat Castle, A True Story of Murder, Race, and the Gothic South, and most recently, No Common Ground, Confederate Monuments and the Ongoing Fight for Racial Justice. She has an essay in the New York Times bestseller, Myth America, Historians Take on the Biggest Legends and Lies About Our Past. Dr. Cox has written op-eds for the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, Time Magazine, Publishers Weekly, Smithsonian Magazine, and the Huffington Post. She has given dozens of media interviews in the United States and around the world, especially on the topic of Confederate monuments. She appeared in Henry Louis Gates' PBS documentary, Reconstruction, America After the Civil War, Lucy Worsley's American History's Biggest Fibs for the BBC, and the Emmy-nominated documentary The Neutral Ground, which examines the underlying history of Confederate monuments through the lens of monument removal in New Orleans. Her current book in progress explores the Rhythm Club Fire, a tragedy that took the lives of more than 200 African Americans in Natchez, Mississippi in 1940. When it happened, it was the deadliest club fire in the history of the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest on this podcast, Dr. Karen L. Cox. All right, Dr. Karen L. Cox. How you doing? You doing good?
I'm doing great, and I'm happy to be with you, Eric.
I am really honored to have you. I had seen you on some documentaries. I think you was on one with Professor Gates dealing with Reconstruction. And then, of course, I saw the Mississippi connection that you got your PhD at Southern Mississippi. And I lived in Mississippi for 34 years. And I said, oh, yeah, well, I got to get her on. So especially with the subject matter you deal with. So I'm really honored to have you.
Thank you.
All right. So what I normally do is I try to pull out a quote that relates to either the topic that we're dealing with, something that you might have written or something that you might have said. And so this is your quote. It says, the landscapes of government institutions should not send the message through flags or monuments that any of its citizens are second class. Tell me about that quote.
I think that might come from that Huffington Post piece, right after the Charleston massacre at Mother Emanuel Church. I felt like I wanted to write about it, and I felt like it was bigger than a flag. It was a flag and a monument, but it's an entire culture. But I have been consistent about this since then. that these symbols, which is a symbol of a war fought to maintain the system of slavery, do not belong on government grounds. Those places are seats of democracy in those, whether it's a county courthouse or it's the state house. It's supposed to be the seat of democracy in that county or that state. And you're sending out a terrible message to African Americans in particular of their second class citizenship. That, in other words, you venerate the Confederacy without consideration of all citizens in that state or that county or, in the region. So it's my point of view that they absolutely do not belong there.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's where the vast majority are.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, it's an amazing thing, and we'll kind of touch on it a little bit in the interview. But I want you to explain to the listeners this concept of the lost cause. What does that mean? And then what are the 5 myths that have evolved from that term in your perspective?
Well, the lost cause is a narrative, a mythology that emerges right after the Civil War ends in the South. The term lost cause comes from the title of a book called The Lost Cause that was written and published in 1866 by a guy named Edward Pollard, who was a journalist in Richmond. And that term came to represent how white Southerners felt about Confederate defeat, that it was their lost cause. And sometimes they refer to it as a sacred cause. And so as any mythology has, it has myths built within the larger mythology. And so I'm not going to, I chose 5 for an article that I worked on for the Washington Post, but I'm going to try to I don't remember all 5 because there's so many of them I picked. But the number 1 myth is that the war wasn't about slavery. That's the number 1 myth, that the war was about states' rights, not slavery. There's also a myth that somehow the Ku Klux Klan of Reconstruction was some heroic organization, that they reestablished the racial order in the South. There's a myth about Robert E. Lee as being a kindly, master of slaves, and when he was a brutal master. Or a myth that the only reason that the South lost the war was because they were outnumbered and the North had more munitions. And so all of these myths are excuses for defeat, or try to justify defeat, and help, because white Southerners felt that when they entered this war, or the Civil War, that they were going to swiftly defeat the North because they felt they had better civilization, that they had, the better soldiers, etc. And so being so handily defeated led them to create this mythology. And as I say, it emerges during Reconstruction, but it grows and gains in strength over time, well into the 20th century. And I would say it's still with us today, because people will still say that war wasn't fought over slavery, it was over states' rights, that the war was not about slavery. I mean, we've witnessed this recently with Nikki Haley, a presidential candidate who was, hesitant to say, when asked, that the war was about slavery. And there is no question that that's what it was about. But what's important, I think, for people to understand about the lost cause mythology and narrative, I'm just like, it's a bag of a sack of lies is what it is. But what's important though to understand is just how embedded it is within Southern culture and in the white South, but also the ways in which people outside of the South bought into the myth. Because I could, if I, we were looking at images, just imagine this image of people during the civil rights movement, harassing people at a lunch counter. We would think, and I can give you an example I could show you a photograph of that happening at a White Castle in Bronx, New York, with all the battle flags. It's online. People can look it up. And there was a protest by the Congress of Racial Equality in 1963 to desegregate the White Castle. And in the Bronx, and people showed up in the Bronx, young white men waving Confederate battle flags. So what I'm saying is about the lost cause is that it's been, accepted and used outside of the region. And essentially it's a way of justifying and maintaining their own racism and ideas of white supremacy.
Yeah, and it was really telling about Ambassador Haley, because she was the governor of South Carolina. If there's anybody that would know that, and especially considering the tragedy that happened at Mother Emanuel Church, which led her to take the flag down as the governor, that that would have been one of those no-brainer questions.
And also that she well knows that South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union, and in their ordinance of secession, they say it was about slavery.
Exactly.
So she just got blinders on, but actually she's being a politician here. She's trying to have it both ways. She comes out later and acknowledges it, but then she also, kind of plays footsie with the neo-Confederates.
Yeah, and that's a whole issue about it, and that's the reason why I wanted to highlight this deal about the lost cause, because as you pointed out, it doesn't matter what part of the country it's in, you see that Confederate emblem, being used, and throughout the civil rights movement, there were states, well, especially after Brown versus the Board of Education, states were putting the Confederate flag into their state flag. And then some southern states have been slick with it, like Arkansas, for example, Florida, Texas. They did it in a way where it didn't immediately draw the ire or whatever. But if you understand and I think the term is etymology or whatever about flags, or, not etymology, lex or something, because etymology is words. But I had to learn all that when I was dealing with my flag stuff in Mississippi. But they incorporated the Confederate flag in ingenious ways in some of those southern states. So, and then the other thing was, if we were doing a quiz show, you would have got 3 of the 5 that you said right.
Sorry, I don't know what the other 2. I'm like, there's so many of them.
Yeah, you threw in the one about the Klan, which thanks to the birth of a nation, that kind of propelled that myth. But the other 2 you had mentioned was Confederate monuments only recently becoming controversial, and removing Confederate monuments is erasing history.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that, because that's just one of those things that people say all the time, like, oh, you're erasing history. You're not erasing history if you remove a monument, because monuments aren't about history to begin with. They don't represent history. What they represent is a memory that white Southerners have of the war and their ancestors, etc., which glorifies the Confederacy. So you're not, to me, they're monuments of the Jim Crow period. They're artifacts of the Jim Crow period. So you're not, this isn't about Civil War history at all. So that's one. And also, there's an assumption that, we didn't have a problem with Confederate monuments being on the landscape until Black Lives Matter movement started, criticizing them. Well, that's just not true either, because there's been an ongoing critique of Confederate monuments from the days of Frederick Douglass. I mean, he makes a comment about it in 1870. He's and then W.E.B. Du Bois also criticizes monuments, and Southern Black journalists also are criticizing monuments. I mean, and I, give you numerous examples. So it isn't something that happened only in recent years. There is a legacy of protest against Confederate monuments by Black communities in the South. Now, how they did that in the early Jim Crow period, yes, they couldn't go and protest a monument, physically protest. They would have been lynched for that. But there are ways in which they can have a conversation about that. To I know that some of them were defaced. If you can't get caught, some of them might have been defaced in that way. But in the pages of the Chicago Defender, for example, I ran across a column. It's like called "What do you think about it?" And they would ask a question each week, and that question was, "Do you think there should be a federal law prohibiting monuments to the Confederacy?" And as we know, the Defender goes through, gets shared throughout the South, and people wrote in and said yes. It was a resounding yes. That we wish there were a federal law prohibiting Confederate monuments, because if we didn't have these things, then, white people in the South wouldn't be so, encouraged to practice hatred against our people. That was one of the responses, but there are several, So there were ways in which those critiques were there. Now, once in those years immediately following the Civil Rights Movement, I mean, those acts, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were passed. Then you see people coming out and protesting and, physically protesting against these monuments. And so, and again, when you see the first elected officials since Reconstruction, they begin to criticize these things in the 70s. And so, so there's this longer history, and people need to understand that the protest just didn't happen in the last few years.
Yeah, and there's one example that I want you to kind of delve into a little more if we got time, but I think we're going to have time to get to it. But I want to ask a couple other questions before we got to that. I believe there's a direct correlation between Moms for Liberty and the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Do you agree with that? And if you do, what do you think the correlation is from a historical perspective?
Right. I've thought about this because people have asked me about this, and I think there are some parallels there. Absolutely. One being that the United Daughters of the Confederacy was, made their presence known in the school system. They were monitoring textbooks to make sure that the textbooks were, in their case, sympathetic to the South or the Confederacy. And likewise, Moms for Liberty are monitoring textbooks, and then banning them. The Moms for Liberty, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, are both organizations are very well connected politically. The members of the UDC were married to, related to, in some fashion, to the power brokers in the South, and in that early period. And similarly, Moms for Liberty have people in their organization that are also connected to political power. I mean, look, a few months ago in Philadelphia at the Museum of the American Revolution, they had a meeting, and the main, presidential candidates for the Republican Party were there. But they're also, well, that couple in Florida, I can't even remember, Bridget Ziegler. Yeah, like
Right.
she's got herself in some hot water, but here she's like married to the guy who's was head of the GOP in Florida, and they also accept PAC money down there, that the Moms for Liberty. Now, in other words, so there are similarities there too. The United Daughters of the Confederacy, if they wanted, could shake down politicians to get money for their projects. They wanted these monuments built. They want, certain things done. And the Moms for Liberty know exactly how to go after, politicians to get what they want. And so there are a lot of similarities. The thing where they differ is the level. I mean, one more thing. The United Daughters of the Confederacy, while it mostly existed in the South and was founded in the South, had chapters in every state in the Union. And so likewise, Moms for Liberty starts in the South and has spread throughout all the states in the Union. But I think what's different is that the ability of social media to grow that organization, and their ability to fundraise at an amount that we couldn't even fathom for Moms for Liberty. But so there are those things. But one of the big differences in, where it comes to school boards, et cetera, the UDC in the Jim Crow South, the United Daughters of the Confederacy did not have to worry, did not have to bug the school boards, did not have to bully school boards to get what they want, because white people in the South were on the same page. They believed in that. They believed in a system of Jim Crow white supremacy and, and putting books into children's hands that are going to, perpetuate that. It's different now, because there's more diversity, political diversity within the South. And so, so what we have now is, Moms for Liberty, like bullying school boards and teachers, which wouldn't have had to happen in, the Jim Crow South, but now that it happens. But I think that if the UDC hadn't got what they wanted, they would have acted just like that. They would have bullied some people.
I kind of have the same feeling. Yeah, I kind of have the same feeling. They would have had the clout to do the bullying. So I'm gonna ask you a tough question.
Okay.
When historians in the future look back about the lost cause ethos mythology, which U.S. president will they say gave it more life? Woodrow Wilson or Donald Trump?
Oh, God. Well, historians don't play that crystal ball game generally, right? They don't like, I think what happened in the early Jim Crow period, you had not just Woodrow Wilson, you had William Howard Taft before him that was very sympathetic to the South, and but they didn't need the president.
Yeah.
The UDC didn't, because this was a on the ground operation. Most the UDC wasn't like, while they had a national organization and they had officers at that, it really functioned on a local level. So in order for them to perpetuate the lost cause, I think the lost cause really got spread locally and regionally. So they would have done it without the president. I think what's interesting about, some people disagree with me that that Trump is perpetuating a lost cause by continuing to harp on the big lie, right? But I think they're not the same, but they're similar. So Trump's law has his own lost cause.
This is true. Yeah.
He has his own lost cause, and he's doing, though, the same kinds of things, right? It's a reaction to loss. He lost the election, and we have to justify the loss, or blame the loss on other things other than our own failures. And so that's the way in which, his movement and the lost cause are similar.
Yeah. So in essence, you're saying he's creating his own ethos as opposed to attaching it to the historical ethos of the lost cause.
True. But he dabbles in it, right? He dabbles in the lost cause when he, especially after Charlottesville and saying that there were fine people on both sides, that kind of thing. He dabbles in it when he'll say things about monuments, and he'll, and he knows which buttons to push.
Right. All right. So in the fourth, getting back to what you were talking about movements to deal with monuments, in the fourth chapter of your book, No Common Ground, you tell a story about Harvey Gantt, which I think epitomizes white backlash. Kind of summarize that story for the audience.
Well, Harvey Gantt, for people who may be unfamiliar, he probably is best known from his campaign against Jesse Helms for the U.S. Senate back in 1990. But his political career began much earlier. First of all, he's a trained architect. He's he's integrated Clemson University. He was like the second African American to serve on the city council in Charlotte, North Carolina. And in 1980 became the first black mayor of Charlotte and served 2 terms. So that's a little bit of his history. But he represented that group of black elected officials that were elected after the Voting Rights Act, and the first black elected officials, that generation that were elected since Reconstruction. And there was an effort in Charlotte to place a Confederate monument in 1977, which is late, 1977, on the grounds of the City Hall. Now, and he spoke out against it. And he spoke out against it eloquently. He knew what all of that meant because he had grown up in Charleston, South Carolina. He was confronted with the Confederacy on a daily basis. But he knew his history. He knew his history really well, and he kind of spoke from that understanding and that knowledge. And but still, regardless, that monument went on the grounds of City Hall. He continued to be successful politically in Charlotte, and he get to 1990 to go up in the U.S. Senate race against Jesse Helms, and he was doing well in that race until they ran this. There's a famous ad called the Hands ad where it looks like a white job applicant is just wads up his application and throws it away because he's not going to get this job because of affirmative action. He'll have to, this. And he told me, I interviewed him for the book, and he said, with that ad just changed the race. It changed the race. But he still did really well. He got 47% of the vote in the state. So he did very, very well. But that scared the bejesus out of people in the GOP in North Carolina. I mean, I think it scared them probably across the country, because what you see in the 1990s, 4 years after that race, was the return of Republicans to control over the House of Representatives, and Newt Gingrich is leading them with this contract, for America. But what you begin to see in the 1990s as a backlash to success and the success of African Americans since the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, there had been a lot of progress, and that they couldn't take, white Southerners in particular couldn't take it, but I think white Americans, some of them, couldn't take it as well. And so we begin to see a backlash against that progress, and you begin to see the initial efforts at gerrymandering in the South and gerrymandering districts. And it's only gotten worse, as many people know.
Yeah.
I mean, I live, in North Carolina, and it's so bad. It's so gerrymandered that now, I mean, it'd be hard to, elect Democrats, into the state legislature. So what we have now is essentially minority rule.
Right. And it's not just in the South, because, we were talking about,
right.
In Wisconsin, for example, I was talking to another guest at one time, and if you looked at the statewide numbers, 2/3 of the electorate in Wisconsin voted for a Democrat to be in a legislative position, but the legislature, because of gerrymandering and redistricting, the majority of the legislature is Republican. So yeah, that was a big deal. But the other thing I wanted to highlight about the Gantt story, which I appreciate, what you were telling, the reason the monument was 1977, from what I understand, was because Councilman Gantt and others were pushing for a monument for Dr. King. And Dr. King's monument was approved, and so was this other councilman there that said, well, if you're gonna have basically you're gonna have a monument for Dr. King, then we need to have a monument for the Confederacy, and that's how that fight started.
Yeah, there's been several examples of that. It was like they tried. It's a false equivalence, between what Dr. King represented, who wanted to see, who represented the best of democracy, and then those who try to tear it apart.
Right, and go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That I was thinking about, there was a similar case. And I can't give you the dates, but it was in Alabama where there were efforts to erect a monument to, I just blanked on it. Oh, for goodness.
That's okay.
Jesse, the runner.
Oh, Jesse Owens.
Jesse Owens, sorry, I don't know why I just blanked on it.
That's okay.
Jesse Owens, there was an effort to put a monument to Jesse Owens in the town he was from in Alabama, and the response was, well, if you're going to do that, we need a Confederate monument.
Yeah, and
it was that kind of thing.
Which leads me to this question: what can history teach us about how to deal with white backlash? Because that to me, that seems to be the major problem. Whenever you see some progress, whether it was Reconstruction or like you highlighted after the Civil Rights Movement, and you almost, it's coming. Yeah. So what history is supposed to be a guide to teach us how to do better. What can we learn from history to try to navigate around it or even defeat white backlash so it won't alter the landscape like it normally does?
Well, I think the problem that we're seeing, what we're facing right now, is like history can teach you those lessons and can be useful. And there's been a generation of young people who have learned good lessons from history about how this all functions. But in the last few years, as you know, there's been attacks on teaching history. They call it CRT, but what they're saying is they don't want you to learn about Black history.
Right.
You can call it whatever you want, but what you're saying is and so they're whitewashing history right now. And they know that to me, this is like a page out of the playbook of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. We're going to teach you one kind of history, and you will come to believe that history, and you will come to defend that history. And you will not know what else is, because everything else is outside of your blinders. And so this is why I speak and I write about these things and everything, because it's like we can't give in to the Moms for Liberty. We can't give in to that. And it's a sad state of affairs because history does teach us those lessons. And I think that there's been, people in the GOP or on the right have been playing a long game here. And then in recent years started going after school curriculum and school textbooks. And in doing that, they're preventing people from learning that history. I think the battle then is at the local level with local school boards and things like that, that people have to, like, Democrats are not good about putting up a fight. They're not the white ones anyway. Because one of the things they'll say, it's like, the GOP has always been like well organized and they know how to get their people out there. And I don't think the Democratic Party does that as well, and things kind of like all of a sudden it's here and now they're like wringing their hands about it, but you could see it coming,
Yeah.
So what I try to do is push back against these false narratives about the past. We all need to do that. We're all trying to figure it out. There are several people on TikTok, historians on TikTok, that are doing a pretty decent job of that. Part of the reason I got over there, and I've made some TikToks about the lost cause and things like that. It's why I do interviews for podcasts like yours. It's why I've signed on to amicus briefs about this kind of thing. I'm only one person, but I'm trying to do everything I can. And I think that each of us has to do that. But history has good lessons for us.
Yeah.
And we ought to the youth of our nation ought to be able to learn that history, read that history, and make their own decisions.
I agree totally with that. Yes, ma'am. All right. So we're up against it, but I wanted you to talk a little bit about this book that you're working on dealing with the Rhythm nightclub fire that happened in Natchez. I guess it was like April of 1940.
Right. Yeah. I've worked on a history book set in Natchez, Mississippi before, and I learned about this awful tragedy called the Rhythm Club fire, and it took the lives officially of 209 African Americans. That fire did, and my research, I've uncovered more than that. But I was like, how is it that I could have lived in Mississippi, studied at the University of Southern Mississippi, and not learned about something that was an event, a tragedy that was the deadliest club fire in the history of the United States when it happened, and continues to be in the top 5. And it's because of who died, right? We all know this. In the era of Jim Crow, who paid attention? So I wanted to write a book about the fire, but also, the story itself has many layers to it. And I want to talk about it through the lens of not only Jim Crow, Mississippi, but also the connections between Mississippi and Chicago. Because a band from Chicago was playing that night. Several members of that band perished in that fire, one of whom, Walter Barnes, who's the leader of the band, was from Vicksburg. So there's story to be told about the Great Migration, that it wasn't just as clean cut as everybody wanted to get out of the Jim Crow South. People still had family back in Mississippi. They still had friends in Mississippi. The band was touring the South on the Chitlin circuit, going to black clubs, playing black clubs, because their people wanted to hear that music too. Because, of course, clubs were segregated at this point. And so I've been thinking a lot about this about this as a migration story, because it's about that, but it's about the black press, how the black press covered it. It's about music. It's about jazz in that period. It's about the blues, because there were at least half a dozen blues songs written about this event. And also it brings us back to Richard Wright, because Richard Wright, who was from there, Adams County, and lived in Natchez when he's a little boy, but his father still lived there when this fire took place. In 1958, Richard Wright wrote a book that was published in 58 called The Long Dream. It was one of the last books he published. And at the center of that book is a club fire with all the markings from the Rhythm Club. And in some ways, I feel like Mississippi never let Richard Wright go. He left, but it was still tugging at him. And so he wrote this book, but it was based on, he had gone to visit his father. He probably, I think about 6 weeks after the fire, he'd gone to Natchez, and he probably saw the burned out, building, and knew, how it was impacting people there. So I think there's just so much that's rich about this story, and it's a story that I feel like I want to tell this story. I mean, I know I'm a white person. I'm about as white as you can get in color, but I like to think I care about history, and in my heart I care about the people that I'm writing about, and I care about that those victims get their just due and have their story told, and not as a number, but as who they were and what that meant to their community. And a few weeks from now, I'm flying to San Antonio to meet this woman I interviewed twice, who I know is probably the last surviving witness to the fire. She's turning 100 years old.
Wow.
And she lived right next door to the Rhythm Club. And she was 16 when it happened, had tickets, and didn't go. And that's why she's still with us today.
Wow. Well, when the book comes out, you're going to have to make a stop here and talk about it.
Oh, absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely. And I'm hoping to be in Chicago this summer to do some research. I've applied for fellowships. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, well, going in the summer is better than going in the winter, I tell you that.
That's what I hear.
So tell people how they can get in touch with you in the meantime, and plug anything that you want to plug.
Yeah, I have a website, Karen Cox Historian, all one word, KarenCoxHistorian.com. And there's a place on there if people wanted to email me, there's a contact form there, and I'm pretty good about responding. And, if anything, if anybody's listening out there that knows this story, the Rhythm Club, or, and wants to tell me their story, I'd love to hear it. Even if it's passed down, because that's still part of the memory of the event.
Well, Dr. Karen L. Cox, it has been an honor to have you on. I knew it was going to be a good interview, it was like you were kind of getting a little frustrated because you couldn't remember Jesse Owens. But the old adage I tell people is, I know I've forgotten more stuff than you'll ever know. So, I'll give you that credit, because you've really done in-depth research throughout your whole life about Southern history. And I think it's in a political discussion, I think it is really, really important to have somebody with your authority and your knowledge in the discussion, because I believe that a lot of the politics that we're dealing with now stems from wounds and hurt and lack of pride based on what happened in the Civil War. We're still fighting those battles. So I thank you for coming on, and I look forward to having you on in the future.
Thank you, Eric. I've enjoyed our conversation very much.
Yes, ma'am. All right, guys, and we'll catch y'all on the other side. Until next time.